Welcome to the Last Refrain. Thank you for joining us in the liminal space between worlds. In the first half of our storytelling tonight, our tales have a muse, if you will, the haunting melodies and evocative lyrics of music. Not all of the most chilling tales are found in ancient tomes or dusty manuscripts. Some are woven through the verses we know by heart. These are all original stories, written and created by me and a couple of friends, and inspired by some of our favorite songs. I will read you the lyrics first, followed by the story. I do so hope you enjoy them. And then our second half of our evening, I'll have 3 classic ghost stories from August Derleth, Ambrose Bierce, and Mary Elizabeth Councilman. So, our journey begins now with the haunting echoes of the song Persecuta by Leper. It's a story of love and obsession that transcends the grave, and of spectral devotion that demands a terrible price. The lyrics you're about to hear paint a picture of a love so profound it's become a living haunt. And then we will attend as the song tells us the true story of Ruby and Aiden's undying love. So as the moon climbs higher and the air grows colder, let us settle in. Don't worry about the wind rattling the windows or the way the shadows in the corners seem to writhe. Close your eyes, listen closely, and imagine that it's me, telling you a tale, oh so sweetly. Persecuta by Leper. So our story begins where the line between grief and madness begins to blur. It's here that Ruby holds her own longingly sorrowful ritual. The fog in the old stone burying ground was a living thing, thick and pale, swirling around the crooked headstones like a slow, mournful dance. Ruby sat on the weathered earth, her shawl pulled tight against the late October chill, a single candle in a jar flickering beside her. She had come here every night for a year since the day she lay Aiden to rest, a ritual of love and longing. The wind whispered through the gnarled oak branches, and Ruby heard the phantom howls she had grown so accustomed to, the wolves that sang their lonely song, just as the lyrics had promised. Darling, close your eyes, the wolves howl tonight, she murmured, reciting the words as an invocation, her own voice almost lost to the wind. Imagine that it's me, serenade you oh so sweetly. Ruby had always been a hopeless romantic, a believer in the kind of love that defied even death. Aiden, the realist, had scoffed at her notion of spending her life across his grave. But on his deathbed, a fleeting look of fierce love had crossed his face as she told him her greatest fear. Promise me, darling, haunt me, she had whispered, a plea born of a terror far worse than ghosts, the terror of being alone. Aiden, with a final wry smile, had promised he would try. And now, Ruby was left in the aftermath, embracing her madness. For a year she had been listening for him. The moonlight, full and bright tonight, cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and twisted. They weren't scary, not to her. To Ruby, they were familiar, like old friends. She had come to know the dance of the moonlight and the shadows as the memory of his love. Tonight, however, felt different. The fog grew denser, a cool mist settling over her skin. She felt a presence, not a sudden chill or a frightful sound, but a gentle pressure on her shoulder, a phantom weight. She didn't dare look. The agony of pressing on, she whispered to the air, letting go when shadows fall. She was not letting go. She had found that nothing was truly lost, not if you held on to it with enough love. A rustling in the fog caused her to open her eyes. Standing a few yards away was a form, translucent and shimmering, a perfect silver outline in the moonlight. It was Aiden. He was just as she remembered him, his hair a little disheveled, his hands in his pockets. He seemed to be looking at her, a hint of his old familiar smile on his spectral face. He didn't speak, Instead, a soundless melody drifted through the air, carried on the breeze. It was the softest tune, a gentle humming serenade that felt impossibly sweet and terribly sad. It was his promise, fulfilled. She wasn't being tormented by a ghost, not in the classic sense. This was a haunting of love, a beautiful madness she had willingly embraced. Her heart didn't break. It filled with a crushing, aching love for the memory before her. She was alone to greet the dawn, yes, but she wasn't truly alone. She had her ghost. Ruby closed her eyes again, feeling the spectral melody fill her soul. The wolves still howled, and the moonlight was full and bright. But now, a soft, loving presence was there with her, dancing in the fog. She was haunted, not by terror, but by a love so profound it had transcended the grave. And as her lover serenaded her from the other side, she finally felt a bittersweet peace, knowing that her greatest fear had led to her most cherished wish. He had come home to her. So the candles guttered low, the last notes of Ruby's vigil fade into silence. Yet in that silence, another melody stirs, one born not of love fulfilled, but of longing imprisoned in ivory and ink. Patience, please, as I switch to piano. Then listen with me, as the song itself tells us its ghostly tale. I was created in a tempest of sorrow. The one who made me was a master of his craft, but a servant to his grief. He hammered my first notes into the piano's ivory with the force of a heart breaking, and the sound of it lingered in the silence, a fragile, trembling ghost. My purpose, he told me without words, was to whisper of a woman named Thurs. I was to be a portrait of his longing, yet a curse of his obsession. I am a memory, trapped in a cage of ink and paper, condemned to replay his heartache forever. My existence is a rondo, a cycle of emotional seasons. It begins with the gentle, wistful memory of her. A delicate, repeating motif is the ghost of her laughter, a phantom touch on the keys. It is a moment frozen in time, a bittersweet lie that whispers, "She still loves you." For those few tender measures, I am a melody of hope. But a ghost cannot linger in one place for long. The memory turns turbulent, and my notes rise in a cascade of frantic fury. This is the truth of his mind, the echo of her rejection that could not be silenced. I am a storm of sound now, a turbulent, anguished cry of loss. The notes, once soft, now scream. This is the part of the story he tried to bury, the memory of his humiliation. He beat the keys, his deafened ears rattling with the noise of his broken dream. Then the storm fades, and I am drawn back to the fragile, sorrowful beginning. The simple, mournful arpeggios, the ghost of her name. I am forced to repeat the cycle, returning to the longing over and over again, like a soul bound to a familiar misery. His obsession is the cage, and I am the bird that must sing of its captivity for eternity. He put me away, a discarded memory among his scribbled manuscripts. My title was a mistake, a misread word on a page, but it is a fitting epitaph for a love that never was. He wrote Thurs, but another read Thurs Elise. And so the ghost was given a new name, a new identity to haunt, but the heartache remains the same. And so I am trapped, not a song but a haunting, a melancholy echo of a love that was poisoned by obsession. The hands that play me now do not know of the pain that forged me, but they feel my sorrow. And for as long as I am played, the ghost will linger, whispering of a love that was lost and a heart that was broken, and the eternal return of sorrow dressed in beauty. And so, from a soul trapped in a melody, to lovers set free by one, our next tale reminds us that eternity need not always mourn. Sometimes the hand that reaches from beyond is not to haunt, but to hold. Eleanor and James' love began in the way many great stories do, simply and unexpectedly. Their meeting was a quiet, unassuming moment in a high school hallway, far from the dramatic first encounters of novels. It was a recognition, a subtle and powerful sense that they had always belonged together. Their love was an eternity. The song is Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult. Eleanor felt the chill of the wind long before the door opened. It was a strange draft, cold and sweet at once, smelling of rain on old leaves and something floral and heavy, like lilies in a graveyard. The candles on the mantel sputtered and then vanished, not snuffed out, but gone entirely, their light swallowed by the sudden gloom. The curtains across the bay window flew inward, not rustling, but snapping like a sail in a gale, and just as quickly fell still. In the darkness, he appeared. It wasn't a shadow, not a ghost. It was a man, indistinct, but not hazy, and his eyes were a pair of deep, knowing pools that held all the grief and all the joy of 1,000 lifetimes. He offered his hand. There was no fear in Eleanor's heart, only the deep, aching certainty of recognition. Their time had come. "Come on, baby," he said, his voice the rustle of dry leaves and the soft rumble of distant thunder. "Don't fear the reaper." She didn't. Eleanor had been with James since high school, a love story as old and worn as the earth itself. They had built a home, raised children, and watched seasons turn together. Their love wasn't just a passion. It was a constant, like the sun and the rain. When James left, not with a sickness, but simply gone in the quiet wave of an old tree finally falling, she had felt not a rending, but a thinning. She was a canvas with half the paint missing. In the years that followed, Eleanor lived, but did not live fully. She was a ghost in her own house, moving through the rooms with a sorrow that ached in her bones. Their love, like the star-crossed lovers of Verona, was not meant for a single lifetime. It was a promise of an eternity. And now he was here to collect on that promise. "I'm your man," he whispered, his voice resonating in the silence. Eleanor took his hand. It wasn't cold or ghostly, but a strong, reassuring grip she had known all her life. The world around them began to dissolve, not into darkness, but into a kaleidoscope of light and memory. She saw herself, a young woman in a sundress, laughing as James kissed her by the river. She saw their first Christmas tree, the years blurring together in a montage of anniversaries and birthdays. She saw the last night of sadness, a tear on her cheek as she finally gave up the fight against loneliness. And as the last walls of her world faded away, they began to fly. They looked back one final time at the house, a small, quiet island in a vast, glittering expanse. It was a goodbye to the world of rain and sun, to the cycles of the seasons, and to the fear of what comes next. As they soared, she realized with a gasp that she had become like the wind in the seasons. She had no fear, for they would spend eternity together, a love story written not in ink, but in the rustle of the wind and the beat of a distant drum. Theirs was a love beyond the grave, a promise fulfilled. And for an eternity, they would not fear the reaper, for he was already holding her hand. But not every hand that reaches from the grave comes with love. Obsession, when wound too tightly, can turn even devotion into machinery. Come with me now into the fog-shrouded streets of Blackfriars, where grief hums in gears and steam. Some rest is not to be disturbed, no matter the price. And our song is Stretched on Your Grave by Abney Park. The city of Blackfriars was a metropolis of steam and sorrow, its endless gray skies perpetually smudged with soot from industrial engines. Morwen, an engineer's apprentice, knew its cobblestone streets better than the back of her own hand, having traced every winding path from her father's cluttered workshop into the ornate, forbidding gates of the city's great metropolis. Her destination was always the same, the grave of her childhood love, Cassian. The traditional lyric spoke of a simple, honest grief, but Morwen's pain was a far more complex, mechanical thing. Her grief was a wound that refused to close, and her obsession had twisted her considerable intellect. Instead of mourning, she began to build. On the outskirts of the necropolis, powered by scavenged clockwork and pulsating with a strange dark energy, a massive gramophone sat beside Cassian's tombstone. Its brass horn, tarnished green with time and rain, was aimed directly at the fresh earth. Every night, while Morwen's family believed her to be safely in bed, Morwen would sneak out to the graveyard. As the fog thickened and the steam-powered street lamps flickered to life, she would set the gramophone's needle. The air would fill with the melancholic, discordant strains of Abney Park's cursed melody. The sound was not just a song, it was a ritual, a sonic invocation of memory and grief. The industrial thrum of the music pulsed through the damp earth, a mechanical heartbeat calling to the one buried beneath. The other graveyard residents, the actual ghosts, gave her a wide berth. These were the simple, quiet spirits who haunted their appointed spaces. They watched with ancient, fearful eyes as Morwen's contraption whirred and the cold air grew colder. A new kind of terror took hold of their sacred ground. One night, as the gramophone's melody reached its mournful chorus, the ground around Cassian's grave began to crack. A skeletal hand, still clutching a single withered blackthorn branch, pushed its way through the soil. But this was no peaceful ghost. The hand was a thing of clockwork and cold mechanics, pulsing with the same unsettling rhythm as the music. It was Morwen's engineering, her grief, and the old song's desperate wish made real. The hand, and soon an entire arm, emerged from the earth, its joints ticking and clacking. It was Cassian's body, but only a grotesque mockery of it. Morwen had not simply reawakened him. She had turned his first final rest into a cursed clockwork purgatory. He was a mechanical thing, powered by her sorrow and the steampunk gramophone's dark song. But her ritual wasn't over. As the mechanical Cassian, a marionette of rust and bone, fully rose from the grave, she walked toward him, a crazed, ecstatic look in her eyes. "My brightness," she whispered, echoing the song's lyrics. "It's time we were together." But the mechanical creature only turned toward the gramophone, its hollow sockets filled on and fixed on the source of its unending torment. It was not her embrace it longed for, but the blessed silence of death. As Morwen reached for its hand, the creature raised its own clockwork arm and smashed the gramophone, silencing the dreadful music. The sudden quiet was deafening, the oppressive stillness of the grave taking hold once more. The mechanical Cassian, now with no music to animate his cursed parts, crumbled to dust. As it fell, its hand brushed Morwen's. For a moment their hands were finally joined. "If your hands were in mine, I'd be sure we'd not sever," she had always repeated. But this was no fairy tale ending. Her obsession had robbed them both of their rest. As the last of the dust settled, Morin felt a chill unlike any she had ever known. The silence, so long sought by her tormented love, was not hers to enjoy. The other, older ghosts of the necropolis moved in, their whispers like rustling leaves. Her song had awakened more than just Cassian. Now they would have her for their own, drawn to the vibrant grief that had shattered the necropolis's peace. She had stretched herself on his grave, and now, like the rusted clockwork of her gramophone, her own life would wind down into a final, endless silence. And so, this fusion of clockwork and bone brings us to the ending of our musical serenades, our last refrain, fading into silence. But the silence, my friends, belongs to the classics now. The old ghosts have waited patiently, as have you, and they will have their turn to speak. Beginning with The House of Shadows by Mary Elizabeth Councilman. After I have a sip of liquid stuff. Savage very high. The train pulled up with a noisy jerk and a wheeze, and I peered out into the semi-gloom of the dusk at the little depot. What was the place? Oak Grove. I could read dimly the sign on the station's roof. I sighed wearily. 3 days on the train. Lord, I was tired of the lurching roll, the cinders, the scenery flying past my window. I came to a sudden decision and hurried down the aisle to where the conductor was helping an old lady off. How long do we stop here? I asked him quickly. About 10 minutes, ma'am, he said, and I stepped from the train to the smooth sand in front of the station. 10 minutes. Well, so pleasant to walk on firm ground again. I breathed deeply the spicy air of the winter, and I strolled to the far side of the station. A brisk little wind was whipping my skirts about my legs and blowing wisps of hair into my eyes. I looked idly about at what I could see of Oak Grove. It was a typical small town, a little sleepier than some, a little prettier than most. I wandered a block or two toward the business district, glancing nervously at my watch from time to time. My 10 minutes threatened to be up when I came upon 2 dogs trying to tear a small kitten to pieces. I dived into the fray and rescued the kitten, of course, not without a few bites and scratches in the way of service wounds, and I put the little animal inside a store doorway. At that moment, a long-drawn, it seemed to me, derisive whistle from the train rent the quiet, and as I tore back toward the station, I heard it chugging away. I reached the tracks just in time to see the caboose rattling away into the night. What should I do? Oh, why had I jumped off at this cursed little station? My luggage, everything I possessed except my purse, was on that vanished train, and here I was, marooned in a village I had never heard of before. Or had I? Oak Grove. Somehow the name had a familiar ring to it, and I don't think it was from those Stephen King novels. At least I hope not. Oak Grove. Oh, I had it. My roommate at college 2 years before I had lived in a town called Oak Grove. I darted into the depot. Does Miss Mary Allison live here? I inquired of the station master. Mary Dean Allison? I wondered at the peculiar, unfathomable look the old man gave me, and at his long silence before he answered my question. Yes'm, he said slowly, with an old hesitancy that was very noticeable. What, you her kin? No, I went to college with her. I thought perhaps she might put me up for the night. I was idiot enough to let the train go off and leave me. Is she fixed to put up an unexpected guest, do you know? Well, again, that odd hesitancy. We were fair at a Midland hotel right here. Maybe you'd rather stay here, hmm? I frowned. Perhaps my old friend had incurred the disapproval of Oak Grove by indiscreet behavior. It seemed a very easy thing to do in these rural towns. I looked at him coldly. Perhaps you could direct me to her house, I said stiffly. He did so, still with that strange reluctance. I made my way to the big white house at the far end of town, where I was told Mary Allison lived. Vague memories flitted through my mind of my chum as I'd seen her last, a vivacious, cheerful girl whose home and family life meant more to her than college. I recalled hazy pictures she had given me of her house, of her parents, and a brother whose picture had been on our dresser at school. I found myself hurrying forward with eagerness to see her again and meet that doting family of hers. I found my way at last to the place, a beautiful old colonial mansion with tall pillars. The grounds were overgrown with shrubbery and weeds, and the enormous white oaks completely screened the great house from the street, giving it an appearance of hiding from the world. The place was sadly in need of repairs and a gardener's care, but it must have been magnificent at one time. I mounted the steps and rapped with the heavy brass knocker, a Marley knocker at that. At my third knock, the massive door swung open a little way, and my college friend stood in the aperture staring at me without a word. I held out my hand, smiling delightedly, and she took it in a slow, incredulous grasp. She was unchanged, I noticed, except perhaps that her dancing bright blue eyes had taken on a vague, dreamy look. There was an unnatural quiet about her manner, too, which was not noticeable until she spoke. She stood in the doorway, staring at me with those misty blue eyes for a long moment without speech, and then she said slowly, with more amazement than I thought natural, "Liz! Liz!" Her fingers tightened about my hand as though she were afraid I might suddenly vanish. It's so good to see you. Oh, my gosh. How did you come here?" With a queer embarrassment. "Well, to tell the truth, my train ran off and left me when I got off for a breath of air," I confessed sheepishly. "But I'm glad now it did. I remembered you lived here, so here I am." She merely stared at me strangely, still clutching my hand. "There's no train to Atlanta till 10 in the morning." I hesitated and laughed. "Well, aren't you going to ask me in, Liz?" Why? Oh, why, of course," Mary said oddly, as if the idea was strange and had not occurred to her. Come in, Liz, come in." I stepped into the great hall, wondering at her queer manner. She had been one of my best friends in college, so why this odd constraint? Not quite as if she did not want me around, more as if it were queer that I should wish to enter her house, as if I were a total stranger, a creature from another planet. I tried to attribute it to the unexpectedness of my visit, yet inwardly I felt this explanation was not sufficient. "What a beautiful old place!" I exclaimed, with an effort to put her at ease again. Then, as the complete silence of the place struck me, unthinkingly added, "You don't live here alone, do you?" She gave me the oddest look, one I cannot fathom, and replied so softly I could hardly catch the words. "Oh, no." I laughed. "Of course, I'm crazy. But where is everybody?" I took off my hat, looking about me at the colonial furniture and the large candelabra on the walls with the clusters of lighted candles which gave me the only light in the place, for there were no modern lighting fixtures of any kind, I noted. The dim candlelight threw deep shadows about the hall, shadows that flickered and moved. It seemed alive. It should have given me a sense of nervous fear. Yet somehow there was a peace here, a contentment, a warmth about the old mansion. Yet, too, there was an incongruous air of mystery, of unseen things in the shadowy corners, of being watched by unseen eyes. "Where is everybody? Gone to bed?" I repeated, as she seemed not to have heard my question. "Oh, here they are," Mary answered in that strange hushed voice. I had noticed as if someone were asleep whom she might waken. I looked in the direction she indicated and started slightly. I had not seen that little group when I had entered. They were standing scarcely 10 feet from me, just beyond the aura of light from the candles, and they stared at me silently, huddled together and motionless. I smiled and glanced at Mary, who said in a soft voice like the murmur of a light wind, "My mother?" I stepped forward and held out my hand to the tall, kind-faced woman who had advanced a few steps from the half-seen group in the shadows. She seemed without offense not to see my hand, but merely gave me a beautiful smile and said in that same hushed voice Mary used, if you are a friend of my daughter's, you are welcome." I happened to glance at Mary from the corner of my eye as she spoke, and I saw my friend's unnatural constraint vanish, give place to a look I thought wonderingly that was unmistakably one of relief. And my father?" Mary's voice had a peculiar tone of happiness. A tall, distinguished-looking man of about 40 stepped toward me, smiling gently. He seemed not to see my outthrust hand, but said in a quiet, friendly voice, "I'm glad to know you, my dear. Mary has spoken of you often." I made some friendly answer to the old couple, then Mary said, "And this is Lonnie. Remember his picture?" The handsome young man whose photograph I remembered stepped forward, grinning engagingly. So this is Liz. Ha! Always wanted to meet one girl who isn't afraid of a mouse. Remember? Mary told us about the time you put one in the prof's desk, huh? He too, though jovial, spoke in that near whisper that went oddly with his cheery words, and I found myself unconsciously lowering my voice to match theirs. They were unusually quiet for such a merry, friendly group, and I was especially puzzled at Mary's hushed voice and manner. She had always been a boisterous tomboy sort of person. And this is Betty. Mary spoke again, a strange glow lighting her face. A small girl of about 12 stepped solemnly from the shadows and gave me a grave, old-fashioned curtsy. And Bill, said Mary, as a chubby child peeped out at me from behind his sister's dress and broke into a soft, gurgling laugh. What darling kids, I burst out. The baby toddled out from behind Betty and stood looking at me with big blue eyes, head on one side. I stepped forward to pat the curly head, but as I put out a hand to touch him, he seemed to draw away easily just out of reach. I could not feel rebuffed, however, with his bright eyes telling me plainly that I was liked. It was just a baby's natural shyness with strangers, I told myself, and made no other attempt to catch him. After a moment's conversations, during which my liking for this charming family grew, Mary asked if I should like to go to my room and freshen up a bit before dinner. As I followed her up the stairs, it struck me forcibly, as it had before only vaguely, that this family, with the exception of Mary, were in very bad health. From father to baby, they were most pasty white of complexion, not sallow, I mused, but a sort of translucent white like the glazed glass doors of private offices. I attributed it to the uncertain light of the candles, but that they looked rather smoky, like figures in a movie where film has become old and faded. Dinner at 6, Mary told me, smiling, and left me to remove the travel stains. I came downstairs a little before dinner hour to find the hall deserted, and womanlike I stopped to parade before a large cheval glass in the hall. It was a huge mirror, reflecting the whole hall behind me, mellowly illumined in the glow of the candles. Turning about for a back view of myself, I saw the little baby, Bill, standing just beside me, his big eyes twinkling merrily. Well, hello there, old fellow, I smiled at him. Do I look all right? I glanced back at the mirror, and what it reflected gave me a shock. I could see myself clearly in the big glass, and most of the hall far behind me stretching back into the shadows, but the baby was not reflected in the glass at all. I moved with a little chill and just behind him, and I could see my own reflection clearly, but it was as if he was simply not there. At that moment, Mary called us to dinner, and I promptly forgot the disturbing optical illusion, or whatever it was, with the parting resolve to have my eyes examined. I held out my hand to lead little Bill in the dining room, but he dodged by me with a mischievous gurgle of laughter and toddled into the room ahead of me. That was the pleasantest meal I can remember. The food was excellent, the conversation cheery and light, though I had to strain to catch words spoken at the far end of the table, as they still spoke in that queer, hushed tone. My voice, breaking into the murmur of theirs, sounded loud and discordant, though I have a real southern voice. Mary served the dinner, hopping up and running back into the kitchen from time to time to fetch things. But by this I gathered they were in a rather straitened circumstances and could not really afford a servant. I chattered gaily to Lonnie and Mary, while the baby and Betty listened with obvious delight, and Mary's parents put in a word occasionally when they could break into our chatter. It was a merry, informal dinner, not unusual except that the conversation was carried on in that near whisper. I noticed vaguely that Mary and I were the only ones who ate at all, and the others merely toyed with their food, cutting it up ready for eating, but not tasting a bite, though several times they raised a fork to their lips and put it down again as though pretending to eat. Even the baby only splashed with his little fork in his rice and kept his eyes fixed on me, now and then breaking into that merry gurgling laugh. We wandered into the library after the meal, where Mary and I chatted of old times. Mr. Allison and his wife read or gave ear to our prattling from time to time, smiling and winking at each other. Lonnie, with the baby in his lap, and Betty perched on the arm of his chair, laughed with us at some foolish tale of our freshman days. At about 11, Mary caught me yawning covertly and hustled me off to bed. I obediently retired, thankful for a bed that did not roll from side to side all night. I crawled in bed in borrowed pajamas with a book to read myself to sleep by the flickering candle on the bedside table. I must have dropped off to sleep suddenly, for I woke to find my candle still burning. I was about to blow it out and go back to sleep when a slight sound startled the last trace of drowsiness from me. It was a gentle rattle of my doorknob being turned very quietly. An impulse made me feign sleep, though my eyes were not quite closed, and I watched the door through my eyelashes. It swung open slowly, and Mrs. Allison came into the room. She walked with absolute noiselessness up to my bed and stood looking down at me intently. I shut my eyes tightly so my eyelids would not flutter, and when I opened them slightly in a moment, she was moving toward the door, apparently satisfied that I was fast asleep. I thought she was going out again, but she paused at the door and beckoned to someone outside in the hall. Slowly, with an incredible lack of sound, they tiptoed into my room, Mr. Allison, Lonnie, Betty, and the baby. They stood beside the bed, looking down at me with such tender expression that I was touched. I conquered an impulse to open my eyes and ask them what they meant by this late visit, deciding to wait and watch. It did not occur to me to be frightened at this midnight intrusion. There swept over me instead a sense of unutterable peace and safety, a feeling of being watched over and guarded by some benevolent angel. They stood for a long moment without speaking, and then the little girl, bending close to me, gently caressed my hand, which was lying on the coverlet. I controlled the start with a great effort. Her little hand was icy cold, not with the coldness of hands, but with a peculiar windy coldness. It was as if someone had merely blown a breath of icy air on me, for though her hand rested a moment on mine, it had no weight. Then, still without speaking, but with gentle, affectionate smiles on all their faces, they tiptoed out in single file. Wondering at their actions, I dropped off at last into a serene sleep. Mary brought my breakfast to my bed next morning and sat chattering with me while I ate. I dressed leisurely and made ready to catch my 10 o'clock train. When the time drew near, I asked Mary where her family was. They were nowhere in the house, and I'd seen none of them since the night before. I reiterated how charming they were and how happy my visit had been. That little glow of happiness lighted my friend's face again. But at my next words, it vanished into one that was certainly frightened, pleading. I had merely asked them to tell them goodbye. That odd, unfathomable expression flitted across her face once more. They're gone, she said in a strained whisper, as I stared at her perplexedly, and she added in confusion, I mean they're away. They won't be back until nightfall. The last word was so low it was almost unintelligible. So I told her to give them my thanks and my farewells. She did not seem to want to accompany me to the train, so I went alone. My train was late, and I wandered to my ticket window and chatted with the station master. Miss Allison has a charming family, hasn't she? I began conversationally. They seem so devoted to each other. Then I saw the station master was staring at me, so I had suddenly gone mad. His wrinkled face had gone very pale. You stayed there last night? Why, yes, I replied, wondering at his behavior. I did. Why not? And you saw them? His voice sank to a whisper. You mean Mary's family? I asked, becoming a little annoyed at his foolish perturbation. Certainly I saw them. What's so strange about that? What's wrong with them? My approaching train wailed in the distance, but I lingered to hear his reply. It came with that same reluctance, that same hesitancy after a long moment. But, ma'am, they died last year, he whispered, leaning forward toward me and fixing me with intent, wide eyes. Wiped out every one of them except Mary by the smallpox. Gosh, I hope it's not catching. Okay, so now we leave behind parlors and candlelight for a wilder ground. From one haunted house to another, this time a cabin, boarded and forgotten deep in the American woods. But here the isolation is self-imposed and filled with a deeper, more tragic darkness. When a man shuts out the world so completely that a much more primal evil finds its way in. This is The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile nor speak a heedless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently this man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards, weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door and directly opposite a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when that window was not boarded up, and none knew why it was so closed, certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep if heaven had provided enough sunshine for his need. I fancy there are persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lustreless eyes sunken, his face singularly seamed with wrinkles, which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when he was living nearby in that early day. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and a place for coroners and newspapers, you understand. And I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. And that closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterward, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there's an earlier chapter yet, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin, began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young and strong, full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and a light heart. There's no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubts, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life, for what but the magnetism of blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health. But at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness, and passed away, apparently with a never gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like this, We may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn up by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and other things which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow? Tomorrow I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her when she's no longer in sight. Tomorrow I'll miss her. But now she's dead, of course. But it's all right. It must be all right somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an under sense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart should not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck, that knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures startle, some it stupefies. Grief. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life. To another as the blow of a bludgeon which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive at Murlock to have been that way and affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening woods. But the man did not move. And again, nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened, he knew not why, there in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock. He strained his eyes to see. He knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath was suspended, his blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what, had waked him? Where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms. At the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light, soft step, another, sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness, through the seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, his wife's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she was still there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him. At the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor was so violent a thump the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued there in the dark, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. Now there's a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, with a little groping, seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there was darkness blacker than before, and silence, and when he returned to consciousness again, the sun was high and the wood vocal with songs of birds. And now the body lay near the window. where the beast had left it when frightened away with the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay, well, just anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the dead woman's teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. Ooh. Okay, so did her ghost come back to protect her husband? Was she not dead and he tied her up, then the panther ate her? Was there and why was well, there you go. Now all night we've heard ghosts that sing, but our final spirit keeps time. Each tick, 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 a heartbeat. Each beat, 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 a reckoning. And as guilt begins to keep its rhythm, listen well for the sound that never stops as we dip lightly into the next hour with our final short tale. This is The Metronome by August Derleth. As she lay in bed with the pleasant, concealing darkness all around her, her lips were half parted in a smile that was only expression of a relief that the funeral was over at last. No one had suspected that she and the boy had not fallen into the river accidentally. No one had guessed that she could have saved her stepchild if she had wanted to. "Oh, poor Mrs. Farwell, how terrible she must feel." She could hear their words ringing faint and far away in the close-pressing darkness of the night. What remorse Mrs. Farwell had fleetingly felt when at last the child had gone down, when he had disappeared beneath the surface of the water for the last time, and when she herself lay exhausted on the shore, had long since passed away from Mrs. Farwell. She had ceased to think how she could have done it. She had even convinced herself that the river bank had caved in accidentally, that she had forgotten how weak it was there, and how deep the water below, and how swift the current. In the next room her husband moved. He had suspected nothing. "Now I have only you," he said to her, sorrow in the worn lines of his face. It had been difficult for her those first few days, but the definite consignment of Jimmy's body to the grave had lessened and finally dissipated the faint doubts that haunted Mrs. Farwell. Still, thinking soberly, it was difficult for her to conceive how she could have done it. Well, it was certainly impulsive, yes, but irritation at the boy and hatred because of his resemblance to his mother had fostered her desire. And that metronome. At 10 years, a boy ought to have forgotten such childish things as a metronome. If he had played the piano and needed to keep time, that might have been a different thing. But as it was, no, too much. Her nerves couldn't have stood it another day. And when she had hidden the metronome, how he had enraged her by singing that absurd little ditty which he had heard. Walter Damrosch singing explanation of the nickname Metronome Symphony for Beethoven's Eighth on one of the Friday morning children's hour programs. The words of it, those absurdly childish words which Beethoven had sent to the inventor of the metronome, ran through her mind, ringing irritatingly in the chambers of her memory. "How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? My dear, Mr. Melzo, how do you do? How do you do?" Or something like that. She could not be sure of them. They rang insistently in her memory to the second movement of the symphony, beating like the metronome. Tick, 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 endlessly. The metronome of the song had, after all, crystallized her feeling for the son of Farwell's first wife. Mrs. Farwell thrust the song from her memory. Then she began abruptly to wonder where she had hidden the metronome. It was a rather pretty thing, quite modern, with a heavy silver base, a little hammer on a grooved steel rod extended upward against the background of a curved triangle of silver. She had not yielded to her first impulse to destroy it, because she had thought after the boy was gone it would make a lovely ornament, even though it had belonged to Jimmy's mother. For a moment she thought of Margot, who ought to be glad that she had sent Jimmy to his mother, provided there was a place beyond it all. She remembered that Margot had believed. Could she have put the thing on one of the shelves in her closet, perhaps? It was odd that she could not remember something which still stood out as one of her most important acts in the few days immediately preceding Jimmy's drowning. She lay thinking about it, thinking how attractive it would look on the grand piano, just that single ornament, silver against the piano's brownish black, and then suddenly the ticking of the metronome broke into her ruminations. How odd, Mrs. Farwell thought, that it should sound just now while her thoughts dwelt upon it. But the sound came quite clearly to her. Tick, 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 tick. But when she tried to ascertain its direction, she could not do so. It seemed to swell, growing louder and fading away again, which was most unusual. She reflected that she had never known it to do that before, and all the time that Jimmy had plagued her with its ticking. She became more alert, listening more intently. Abruptly, she thought of something and sent an arresting thrill coursing through her. For a moment she held her breath, suspended her faculties. Didn't she hide the metronome after Jimmy had given it to her to wind? Unless her memory failed her, she did. Then it could not now be ticking, for it had been run down. And had it not been wound up again? For a fleeting moment, she wondered whether Henry had found it and wound it for a joke and set it going at this hour. She glanced at her wristwatch. 1:15. It required a far stretch of imagination to believe Henry capable of such a joke. More likely he would confront her with his find and say, "And look here, I thought you told me Jimmy lost this, and here I find it on the shelf. He couldn't possibly have reached there." The thought reminded her that she had hidden it somewhere above Jimmy's reach. She listened. Tick, 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 tick. Did Henry hear that, she wondered? Probably not. He slept quite soundly, always. After a moment's hesitation, she got up, groped about in the dark for her electric candle, and went to the closet. She opened the door, thrust her hand and the candle into the yawning maw of dark, and listened. No, the metronome was not there. Yet she could not help pulling out one or two hat boxes aside to be sure. She almost always hid things there. Mrs. Farwell withdrew from the closet and stood leaning against its closed door, her brow marred by a frown of irritation. Good heaven! Was she destined to hear that infernal ticking even after Jimmy's death? She moved resolutely to the door of her room, but suddenly a new sound struck into her consciousness. Someone was walking about beyond the door somewhere, padding about on soft, muffled feet. Her first thought was naturally enough of Henry, but even as she thought occurred to her, she heard his bed creak. She wanted to imagine that for some reason the maid or the cook had returned to the house, but she could not accept the absurdity of that thought, of their returning for anything at 1:00 in the morning. And burglars were out of the question. Mrs. Farwell's hand rested and hesitated on the doorknob. Then she opened the door almost angrily and looked into the hall, holding the electric candle high above her. There was nothing there. She recognized instantly that she would have preferred to see someone there. How too absurd, she thought, apprehensively irritated. At the same moment she heard the footsteps again, slight and far away now, sounding faintly from the downstairs. The ticking of the metronome had become more insistent, so loud it was that for a frantic instant she was afraid it might wake Henry. Then came a sound that flooded her being with icy terror, the sound of a little boy's voice singing in a far place. "How do you do? How do you do? How do you do, my dear, Mr. Melzo? How do you do? How do you do?" She fell back against the door jamb and clung there with her free hand. Her mind was in turmoil, but in a moment the voice faded and died away, and the ticking of the metronome sounded louder than ever. She felt only relief as she heard its sound superseding that other. She stood for a few moments pulling herself together. Then she tightened her fingers about the electric candle and went slowly along the corridor, pressing herself close to the wall. As she approached the top of the stairs, she clasped her other hand about the small tube of light so that whatever was below might not see. She descended these stairs, apprehensive lest they creak and betray her presence. There was nothing in the hall below, but there was a sound from the library. Gently she pushed the door open, and the ticking of the metronome welled out and engulfed her. She did not at once see beyond the threshold. Only after she had stepped into the room did her eyes catch sight of the vague little shadow against the opposite wall, an indistinct thing wandering along the line of the wall, peering behind furniture, looking upward at the bookcases, reaching phantom hands into corners. Jimmy, looking for his metronome. She stood immobile, her very breath held within her by some impending horror. Jimmy, dead Jimmy, whom she had seen buried that morning. Only the strength of her will saved her from pitching forward in a faint. On came the spectral child. Toward her it came, and past her it went, searching, prying into every nook where the metronome might be hidden, around again and again. With a great effort she found her voice. Go away! Oh, no, go away! But the child did not hear. It continued its phantom quest, futilely covering the same ground it had already covered many times, and the insistent tick, 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 tick of the metronome continued to sound like the strokes of a hammer in the oppressive night-haunted room. Her hand slipped nervously from the tube of light just as the child passed her. She saw its face turned up toward her, its eyes, usually so kind, now malevolent, its mouth petulant and angry, its little hands clenched. Frantically, Mrs. Farwell turned to escape, but the door would not open. After 3 futile attempts to wrench it open, she looked for some obstacle in its movement. The child was at her side, holding its hand lightly against the door, its touch enough to keep the door immovable. She tried once again. The knob turned in her hand as before, but the door refused to budge. The expression on the child's face had become so malignant that she dropped the electric candle in sudden fright and fled toward the window directly opposite the door. But the child was there before her. She tried to raise the window, slipping the lock with her free hand. It would not move. Even before she looked, she felt the child's hand holding the window. There it was, vaguely white, transparent, leaning lightly against the glass. It was the same with the only other window the room contained. When she tried to raise her hand to break the glass, she found the child had only to stand before the window. Her hand could not even penetrate the air to the glass. Then she turned and slipped into the dark corner behind the grand piano, sobbing in terror. Presently the child was at her side. She felt it emanating a ghastly cold that penetrated her thin nightclothes. Go away! Go away! Go away! She felt the child's face pressing close to her, its eyes seeking hers, its eyes accusing her, its phantom fingers reaching out to touch her. With a wild cry of terror, she fled. Once more she made for the door, but the child was there before. Her hand fell upon the knob, and she knew without turning the knob that her effort was in vain. Then she tried to snap on the light, but the same influence that prevented her from breaking the window was again at work. Once more she sought the comparative safety of a dark corner, and again the child found her out and nuzzled close to her like an animal seeking warmth. Then suddenly the gates of her mind pressed inward and collapsed, and Mrs. Farwell felt a deeper, more maddening fear invading her reason. She began to beat at the closed walls with her clenched fist. Then she found her voice and screamed to release the malefic horror that hemmed her in. The last thing she knew was the pulling of the child's spectral hands at her waist. Then she collapsed in a heap against the wall. Something struck her a sharp blow against the temple. At the same instant, the clammy frigidity of the child's phantom body pressed down upon her face. The waiting darkness advanced and engulfed her. Henry Farwell found his wife, lying against the wall near the grand piano. He came to his knees at her side. He had had enough medical training to suspect that his wife had been suffocated by something wet, for there was still a dampness on her features. He did not understand the strong smell of the river in the room. Looking upward, he saw an enormous landscape painting hanging awry above her body. But certainly this could not have made the wound in her temple. It was still on the wall. But then abruptly he saw what had struck his wife and fallen behind the landscape, where it had been hidden. It was the metronome. And so, dear friends, our last refrain fades into silence. The songs have ended, the ghosts have spoken, the night exhales. If you listen carefully, you may still hear a whisper of music in the wind. Or perhaps that's only memory calling you back. But don't go too far. Until we meet again in another shadowed hour, good night. And keep a candle burning.